Wisconsin Congressman Mike Gallagher has introduced two bills he says will help make Congress better serve Americans. He calls them common sense reforms. The first bill would reinstate the ethics pledge former President Trump signed back in 2017, restricting executive branch employees from lobbying for 5 years and preventing them from lobbying on behalf of foreign governments. The second bill would keep Congress from going into recess without first creating a balanced federal budget, create a 5-year ban on lobbying for members of Congress and high-ranking executive branch officials, and end taxpayer-funded pensions for members of Congress. And here to join us today to talk about all this is Congressman Mike Gallagher. So thank you for joining us, sir. Let's talk about these bills you introduced last week. What has been the reaction so far from your colleagues in Congress?
Well, I'd say my colleagues who have been in the swamp for decades are not happy with me, which is a signal that I'm on the right track. But on the other hand, a lot of the newer members of Congress, the younger members of Congress, I think recognize a need for institutional reform, and something has got to change because the American people are losing faith in the basic institutions of our government. And Congress having an 11% approval rating is part of that. And I think the American people on both sides have a discouraging sense that no matter who wins the election, the swamp just gets deeper and swampier. And so these reforms are geared, not in one partisan direction or the other. They're geared towards restoring that balance of power and putting it back with the American people so people can't get rich off of their time in office, and we can start to reduce the careerism that I think is infecting our politics and making it impossible to get anything done in Congress right now.
This is your third term. You're starting your third term in Congress. Drain the Swamp has always been one of your initiatives, if you will. Do you have a sense on which one of these two bills may have a better chance of succeeding?
Well, I actually think the ethics pledge, we basically took the Trump ethics pledge that they rescinded on the last day of the administration. I think it'd be hard for Republicans to argue against that bill, given that the Trump administration seemed to abide by it until the exact last second. And for the Democrats who might argue against it, we saw something similar in the Clinton administration. And so I think there's a strong argument for that. And then within the other bill, the provision that I think will be easiest to make an argument for going forward is the 5-year ban on lobbying for members of Congress and high-level executive branch officials. Again, that was something that former President Trump campaigned on in 2016. And I think the American people just have a gut sense that we have former members of Congress that are getting rich off becoming lobbyists and sometimes lobbying on behalf of the same industries that they conducted oversight over when they were members of Congress. That may not be illegal, but that is corrupt, and we got to clean it up.
One of my sports colleagues likes to say, swing hard in case you hit it. In March of 2017, your first year as a congressman, you sponsored the amendment to institute term limits for both the Senate and the House. That didn't go anywhere. Are these bills maybe a little bit more realistic to attain for you?
They're certainly easier to get done in the sense that they would not require a constitutional amendment. Term limits would require a constitutional amendment, but I haven't given up on term limits. If you gave me a magic wand and I could only use it once, I would wave it in order to enact a term limits bill. I think it's not a perfect solution, but it's the best way we can get at that careerism that I mentioned. We had a brief glimmer of hope when the president supported that bill, and obviously the careerists in Congress slow-rolled it and ultimately defeated it. But we're not giving up just yet. It's the only bipartisan bill on term limits that's out there, and we just had a meeting last week about how we can revive the effort. So at some point, people in D.C. are going to wake up to the fact that over 80% of the American people support term limits.
Let's switch gears to COVID relief. Where do you stand on President Biden's $1.9 trillion proposed plan?
Well, I think it's unfortunate that he's chosen to go in a purely partisan direction, because I think there's a lot of us who are willing to have a discussion and potentially arrive at a principled compromise. In fact, I think all of us are of the mind that, one area that's a no-brainer is making sure that we're getting resources to our hospitals and other vaccinators to ensure that they're getting vaccinations deployed as widely as possible. And to the extent it is a lack of supply from the federal government that's holding that up, we should fix that supply issue as quickly as possible so we can get as many people vaccinated as quickly as possible and reopen our economy fully, and particularly get kids back in school, which is long overdue. So I think there's a lot there in the combating the virus bucket that reasonable people in both parties can get behind. But when you start to get into more controversial partisan proposals such as the $15 minimum wage, which would actively destroy jobs at a time when we need to get people back in jobs, then you're going in a partisan direction, which is unfortunate. And the fact is that we haven't spent the last tranche of $1 trillion that we passed a little over 2 months ago.